Okay, without further ado, the wonderful brother Mickey will rejoin us here. Yes, the wonderful one. Absolutely. He and Thea Bowman. Okay, Ansem, you're all set and ready to go, right?
Okay. Well, that was nice to get a peek into your world and why I'm up here. So thanks for that. And thanks for the nice break I had. Resting over there. Anyhow, this is really killing me to only talk about Thea Bowman for a couple slides because she's probably been the biggest life changer in my life. I first heard of her. She was already dead by the time I heard of her. But I was visiting my dad at home in the Northeast Philly, in the home I grew up in, and he was on hospice care, and we had a hospital bed in our living room, and he was taking a nap. I was the only one home that day, and I picked up the magazines that were on his coffee table, one of which was U.S. Catholic, and in it was the last interview with Sister Thea Bowman. And I read it and thinking I'd never heard of her, and I'll read about her. By the end of it, I thought, whoa, who was this lady? And she talked a lot. It was given while she herself was dying, not shortly before she died. And she said that she liked to think of it as what she was doing was going home, not dying. And that's the language she used, because she said that was the language of my slave ancestors. And she said that we fail in our job as Christians if other people ever leave our company feeling worse about themselves instead of better, because we're here to build each other up and walk with each other and support each other. And she said so many things, and I just thought, whoa, this lady is something. Meanwhile, my dad died, and that was confirming all the more, I've got to get out of teaching. I just couldn't take it. I just knew it wasn't for me anymore. And I don't know if you've all been in that spot. And nothing against I love teachers and education, but it just wasn't my thing. And Thea came through because I asked the community for permission to get out of teaching, and they said yes. And I thought, oh, crap. Now what? If I fail, it's my own fault, you know? And I started painting all these landscapes, and one was worse than the next. And I thought, oh, God, I'm going to be back in that classroom again. And looking back on them now, they weren't as bad as I thought at the time. But in any event, I came across, as two guys came to the house where I was living at the time in Philly, and they had a video with them, and they said, you want to watch this video? Back in the day, remember VCRs? Watch this video about somebody named Sister Thea Bowman. I said, oh, yeah, I read about her last year. So I watched it, and I couldn't sleep that night. And the images were going through my head. And the next morning I got up and I started painting, and I didn't stop for 2 weeks. And out of it emerged 9 paintings in a style very different than anything I'd ever done before. And it was that kind of like, as I say now, she possessed me. And it was just pouring out. And I thought, this is something different, that especially as it came at this time in my life when I was searching for something new. And so I took pictures of them. This is before, I had to go to the drugstore and have all these sets made, and mailed them to people that were in the video. Cardinals and archbishops and her friends and associates, and I just sent them with nice notes and thinking one of them's bound to help me out, like, what am I supposed to do here? Every one of them replied, oh, these are nice pictures, good luck. And I thought, I want it more than that, And so, but then one day, not long after, I got a call. The woman said, is this Brother Mickey? I said, yeah. And she said, this is Pat Shelton. And she said, I'm the head of the Office of Black Catholics for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. I said, oh. And she said, I just opened my mail, and your pictures are literally in my lap. What are we going to do about this? And a half hour later, we planned a music. She said, I'm going to hire a pianist. All the paintings, by the way, have the titles of spirituals. This Little Light of Mine, and you name it. And so she said, let's do a half-hour thing. So I'll hire a pianist. And I brought the actual paintings. I didn't have posters or prints or anything yet at that point. It was all so new. And we scheduled something for a church, a beautiful old church in Philly. And it turns out it was January, and it was Super Bowl Sunday. And I'm thinking, what were we thinking, scheduling this? 2:30 in the afternoon, and at 2:15, no one was there except my family and friends in this big church and the piano player, I remember. And I said to Pat, oh, what a disaster. Why did we schedule it for this day? And she said, honey, didn't anybody ever tell you about BPT? I said, what's BPT? She said, Black People Time. They'll be here. And 25 minutes later, there were 100 people there who came out to hear about Thea Bowman. What little I knew of her, I didn't know hardly a thing. But that was the first of what became over 20 years worth of presentations now with the choir, and all over the country. I've given this presentation, and the choir sings the music, and I share her story. And most places they invite the people to sing, and it ends with "We shall overcome." Just as she ended all her talks, we get everybody up and join hands and sway and sing "We shall overcome." And most of my audiences over the years were white parishes that never heard of her, but we're learning something new and loving it and loving her. So I've had a very close association with her over the years. I've been to her home in Mississippi, stayed right in her bedroom in her family home, and Viterbo University at the mother house of the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And I'll share some of that as I speak. But I just want to give you the background on why Thea is so important to me. And then later it came Dorothy Day, and we ended up doing a book on as well. There's a book on her. It's now out of print that Orbis Press did, called This Little Light. But maybe you can get it on eBay or something. I don't know. I never tried. So anyhow, she was born in 1937 and raised in a town called Canton, Mississippi, which is about 30 miles outside of Jackson. And her father was a medical doctor, and had gone to school in Memphis, the only school in the country that would admit Black students, and only medical school. And we got his degree. He decided to move to this town of Canton because he heard it was a 10,000 population in cotton country, and 10,000 total population, 7,000 of whom were Black folks, sharecroppers living in dire poverty, and the other 3,000 were white, and not one single white doctor who would treat Black people. So when he got out of school, he decided, that's where I'm going. And he went with another doctor friend and a dentist, and they became the medical, that's where he met his wife. They fell in love, got married, and Thea came along in 1937, and her mom called her husband at his office one day. Thea said they were so poor, people couldn't pay them. She said he'd come home with chickens and, things like that as their payment to him. And he was always doing house calls. And she said her mother went into labor Christmas week of 1937 and said, I think it's time. And he had to take her to Yazoo City, 35 miles away, because that was the closest hospital that would admit Black people. And that's where Thea was born. And they lived within walking distance of the Hospital of Canton. And there he was, a doctor. So, that's the world she grew up in. Well, in 1945, the Bishop of Mississippi, the whole state was one diocese, decided he wanted to open a Catholic parish and help center, like a social center. And he invited the Trinitarian sisters, their mother houses in Philly, right next to the high school I went to. But they came down and opened up this social center, and they had invited the Trinitarian priests to staff the place. And the local county wouldn't allow them to build a church because it was going to be for Black people. Black and Catholic was like double dip into hell right in that town. So finally they relented and said, you can build it, but it has to sit like so many way off the street, the street. And you had to put a high fence around it with no sign to identify what was going on back there. And the bishop asked the sisters they said, well, he said, I want to open a school now, the pastor. And they said, well, we're not teachers, we're social workers. So we invited his best friend, one of his dear friends, was the Reverend Mother of the Franciscan Sisters. And he called her. He said, can you help me out? And she sent 4 sisters down there in 1947. I met one of them in their nursing home by the time I came along. My first visit out there, she was blind and was sitting on her bed in her room, in infirmary. And they brought me in. I said, Sister Elizabeth, my name's Brother Mickey, and I'm here to talk to you about Sister Thea. She just lit up. She said, Thea. And she shared her stories. And she said that she was one of the first sisters to go. And she said, we went to register to vote. And the guy looked up at us and said, why don't you in-loving Catholics go back north where you belong and mind your own damn business. Get out of here. And she said, well, they would go to the store. She said, we all agreed as a community not to take a salary. They relied totally on people's donations and help. And they went to only the stores that didn't discriminate against Black people. She said, but we were treated the same. They were in full habit, of course, in the 1940s. And they'd go in and she said if everyone would do their shopping, but if a white family came in, the Black people had to wait until the whites were served. And then they would say, all right, we'll help you now. So she said, that's how it was for us too, and so those first years were miserable, but they defined their sense of ministry. She said 3 of them were teachers and 1 was a nurse. And Mississippi had the highest death rate, infant mortality rate in the country. So they were training these women in midwifery and whatnot. And she said 10 years later, the medical school in Jackson wanted women from Canton because they were so well trained in medical, women's gynecological issues and medical work and all that. So it was just fascinating to learn all that. And anyhow, when it was time to build a school, they had to get a barracks. The Army gave them a no longer used wooden barracks. And it was shipped in 80 miles. And that was the first school. It was a big 1-room schoolhouse. And I met one of Thea's best childhood friends one time I went down there. And she had moved to California and got married and was a grandmother. And she heard that the house had, that they were going to get rid of it. So if nobody bought it, homes for what's that called? Habitat for Humanity. Thank you. They fixed the house up. It had really fallen into disrepair. There were no other Bowman people to take it over. So Habitat for Humanity fixed it up. And so this woman came back to town to meet me. They had my first time there, they arranged for the morning session to be all women that Thea grew up with and knew her as a girl. And the second half were people who were educated by her. And I remember a woman came down from Minneapolis. She was working on her doctoral PhD at the University of Minnesota. And she said, when I heard this was going on, I had to come down and meet you. She said, I had her as a 5th grade teacher. And she changed my life. She said, I would not be getting my PhD if it weren't for her. And so, and I was hearing those stories all over the place. It was so powerful. And the one woman told me, she said, Doris, the first woman I started to tell you about, she said, when I was a kid, she said, Thea and I were in the same class. And she said, I knew her, but we weren't, tight friends. But she said, when I was a little girl, she said, I was sitting on our family porch. She said, I was one of 18 children. And my parents were sharecroppers, dirt poor. She said, we had dirt floor in our house. It was a shack, holes in the roof, no electricity or plumbing. And she said, I was sitting on the porch and 2 nuns in habits walked up with a priest in a cassock. She said, I'd never seen anything like it in my life. And they said, little girl, we're going to open a school next September and we would like you to come. And she asked about it, and then she said, well, I can't go. She said, my daddy can't afford that. It was $1 a year tuition. And they said, don't you worry about that. We'll help you out with that. So she went to the school, and she said, those sisters changed my life. She wasn't even Catholic yet. At that point, she didn't become Catholic till she was an adult. But she said the sisters would have, what do you call that oatmeal stuff they eat down south? Not polenta. That's Italy. What is it? Yeah. And so anyhow, they made the sisters, she said, none of us had food at home. We couldn't afford it. So the sisters made breakfast for them every single morning. And she said, when it was time to clean our uniforms, the sisters would wash them in their convent washing machine. And she said they didn't have a dryer. So they used to put them in the oven so that they were dry enough for the kids to wear when class started. And she said, that's how I grew up. And she said she pointed to a picture on the wall of one of the sisters in the old habit, and she said, she was my hero. She changed my life. And she said, I always promised her that I would come back someday to Canton to do for the kids what the sisters did for me. So that's what brought her back from California. She left her family. She said, I have to go back. And she wanted to start a study center. It was now the town had a lot of Mexican immigrants and all that. So there was a new flavor to it. But at the presentation I gave, a guy came up. He said that he was 85 and he was a lawyer from Jackson. And he said, but I had such love for, he said, when I heard this was happening, I had to come up and be part of it. He said, the house you're staying in, meaning her house, he said, right across the street was the white neighborhood. And he said, as close as they were, he said, you would never see a white person working on that side of the street or a black person on our side of the street. The only colored people that were allowed in our neighborhood were our housekeepers and maids. And we all had them. He said, we loved our maids. They raised us. They cooked our food. They were like our mothers. But Mississippi state law said they could not go to the bathroom in a white person's house. We couldn't live under the same roof, sleep on. So he said, we all had garages and we all put bathrooms out in the garage for the maid to go out and work in. And he said, that's the kind of world that Thea Bowman came out of, It's like, how did she turn into who she was? So when she was so impressed with the sisters, she said they were the first white people that were nice to her. And she wanted to learn more about it. She converted to Catholicism at the age of 9 or 10. Her parents didn't mind that. And then when she was 14, they said, told them, I want to become a Franciscan sister myself. And they said, absolutely not. They thought she was too young and didn't know what she would, they had no history or sense with the sisters. They loved the ones there in town, but anyhow, so she went on a hunger strike. So they finally said, okay, you can do it. And one of her good friends told me that when the sisters went to pick her up, to take her up to Wisconsin, her father was hugging her tight. He had been begging her all along, please don't do this. He was terrified of her. He said, we don't have people up there. He said, they're not going to be nice to you. And he was saying this for months. And finally that day, with the two sisters waiting to take her, he said, I beg you one more time, please don't do this. They're not going to like you. And she said, I'm going to make them love me. And she went out to get in the car, and she had to get on the floor of the car. Because in 1954, a black girl could not be in the same car in Mississippi as white women. And they said there would have been huge trouble, especially with state police, if they saw that. They would pull them over. And so she laid down on the floor of the car, and they went to the train station. And at the train, they said she had to get in the luggage car for the colored. That's where the colored sat. And the nun, I saw all this in their archives, by the way. They kept journals. Nuns back in the day really kept annals every day. And this is all recorded there at their mother house. But she said, we put up such a fuss that they finally said, well, she can sit with you. But she had to sit between two nuns in the white car. And you can just imagine how the other white passengers probably felt, who's this little black teenager, And off they went through Chicago, and she landed in Wisconsin and entered the community. And it wasn't long before she wrote a note home one day saying, it's awful chilly up here, and I don't just mean the weather. So she was encountering the prejudice and within community too. But she said, Jesus and St. Francis of Assisi called me to this, so I know they'll see me through. So that's what kept her going. But her best friends now said that she used to. She never saw another black face for 4 years. I guess there weren't any in La Crosse, at least in that part of town. But there was a native reservation nearby, and she used to love to go over there. And she always said later, she was always the other. And that's why she reached out to people so well. She said, I was the only Catholic in my black world and the only black in my Catholic world. So I knew what it was like to be other. And that's what her version of Christianity, and through music was her great gift, to sing and get people up dancing and swaying and giving her talk. So by the time she died, she was a nationally renowned speaker, and she'd get the audience up, join hands and sing "We Shall Overcome." And so we'll see some of that now too. But anyhow, another woman, a friend of hers, a childhood friend, told me, she said until 1966, when we, meaning black folks, went to Catholic church on Sunday for mass, she said, we had to stand in the back. We weren't allowed. And after all the white people got their communion back in the day, kneeling at the altar rail, and then so once they were all in their seats, then the priest would come back to us. We weren't allowed to go up front and get communion. And I'm thinking, why would anybody choose to be part of a church like that, But that's the Holy Spirit at work, to give people the strength and courage and to say, no, this isn't what the church is about. It's something better than this. And so she also, that same woman told me, she said one day she was out shopping and she said horribly hot. It was summer afternoon. And she had all her shopping bags and all that. She was so exhausted. I'm going to stop in the Sacred Heart Church, the white parish, just for a little, visit and meditation. She was sitting there at the pew. And she said a white woman came back up and tapped her on the shoulder and said, excuse me, but we've provided a perfectly nice place in the back of church for you people to pray. And I thought, what kind of church was that? That wasn't just a Catholic thing either, but it was like, why would anybody choose to become part of that? So it's always, those kinds of stories always raised her up in my mind. And so this is a quote. She said, I bring myself, my black self, all that I am, all that I have, all that I hope to become. So she entered and, Huh? It's not advancing. Did you do this because you got tired of listening to me? Mm-hmm. Okay. You do it every. So she entered, and when after she got her first vows as a young nun, she was sent to the local Catholic school to teach fourth grade. And parents called and said, we're taking our kids out of school if they have to be taught by a black woman. They were fourth graders. And the principal, who was one of the sisters, she said, oh, okay. She said, well, let's have a teacher, come to my office. We'll have a conference about it. So these parents showed up, and she, being a very smart woman, invited Thea to be there. And the people were so charmed by her, they didn't go through with it. But Thea did it for 2 years, and she said afterwards, and you hear it from teachers all the time today, it wasn't she loved the kids, it was the parents who were always a problem. And teachers constantly tell me that today, I love the kids. It's anybody that leaves teaching, it's because of parents of kids. But anyhow, so she ultimately, it's now the 60s. The bishop in 1959 wrote a note to when she was, after her 2 years of teaching up there in Wisconsin, she went back home to Mississippi, and it was now the late 50s. And whenever the sisters went shopping, she had to call her parents to pick her up and drive her to the grocery store or whatever store. And she'd shop with the other nuns, and then her parents would take her back because they weren't allowed to travel in the same car or be together. And there they are in full habit, in the deep South. And then the bishop, this letter's in their archives as well, wrote the sisters and said, please, I know you like to take evening walks together. He said, but stay as close to the convent as you can, because the civil rights movement's rising, and he was worried for their safety that people would attack them. So things are starting to get uglier. And she started teaching all that in her classes. And she said, especially the 8th grade boys who were getting angrier and angrier at this situation. And she said, I had to teach them about Martin Luther King and peaceful change, that it doesn't have to be violent. And she always used music as it. She made a recording of the spirituals and all that. I usually have all pictures for all this, but I wasn't expecting to do all that. But in any event, She ended up getting her doctorate at the Catholic University. She went there in 1968. At the rise of, all the movements, women's liberation, everything was happening. And she met other Black religious for the first time. And she realized she wasn't so weird after all, or such an anomaly. And she befriended a lot of other Black bishops, some of whom came, religious, some of whom became bishops later. And started, she went to Catholic University and started giving talks in the area at schools and parishes, using music to talk about peace and civil rights and whatnot. And then she went back to Viterbo, and then where she was on the faculty for 10 years. The first presentation I did with the music and all that, one of the first, was at the chapel at Viterbo. And I got out there and it hit me and I panicked. I thought, who am I? All I know about her, these are her friends and the people she taught with and students, everything else. I said, I feel like shouldn't be doing this. And one of the nuns said, you're exactly the person who should be doing this, because of your experience of her, you're validating what we already knew from personal experience. So that kind of helped a little bit. But then there was a blizzard. And I thought, thank you, Jesus. I don't have to do this. 250 people showed up in a blizzard because she is that highly esteemed in the town of Viterbo. One woman told me, she said, I think she saved my son's life. He was very, very depressed, and we were worried suicidal when he was in college. And she took him under her wing and had him to her office all the time. And she told me she just changed her life. So she was having that kind of impact. So in 1983, she went home again to the 79, I'm sorry. She went home again to Canton because her parents were elderly and she wanted to be near them. And she lived at home. She got permission to live instead of at the convent, which was a few blocks away. And when she came back that time, the bishop asked her, it was a new bishop, to start an office of Black Catholic ministry, whatever, which she said yes to, and ended up traveling all over Mississippi. Then she go over next door to Louisiana and Alabama, all over the South. She got herself a car. She was giving talks on peace and civil rights and all that in Catholic and public schools, and always getting the kids up on their feet and singing. And that was her main method, music, the language that we all have in common. And then at one point, her mother got very, very sick, and that's when she was glad she was home. But she went to the doctor in 1984 and found out she had breast cancer. And her famous line was, "I'm going to live till I die. I don't know how much longer I have. I'm going to eat the most of every day that's coming." And at one point that summer, both of her parents were in the hospital at the same time in Canton. Her mother died in November of that year, of 84, the year she found out she was sick. And then her father died in December, she said, of a broken heart, of losing her mother. And then she went on, she lived 10 more years, or not 10, six more years. And but vital as ever, traveling around the country till she couldn't anymore. And she was on 60 Minutes with Mike Wallace. So you can Google that, it's on YouTube now. There's another wonderful documentary video about her on YouTube. So just put her name in and you'll see these things. But Mike Wallace went to her home to interview her. It shows him sitting at the kitchen table. And he said, "Sister Thea," he said, "why aren't there more Sister Theas in the world? We really need you desperately." And she said, "Oh, Mike," she said, "ask any of my friends, they'll tell you one is more than enough to deal with." And he said, "Well, what keeps you going?" And she said, "I get up every morning and I look in the mirror and I say, black is beautiful." And he's like, "Oh, that's nice, you know." He asked her another question and she politely answers it. And she said, "Mike, I want to hear you say black is beautiful, like you mean it." And she has him going back until he's saying it as if with a little excitement or energy. And the sisters told me that when that went back to CBS in New York, he interviewed her for like 2 days, and it had to be whittled down to a little 20-minute segment, you know. And when that went back to New York, they said the editing crew was like, "Oh, he's not going to like that." You know, Mike Wallace apparently was a real prima donna. And they said he never would want to be shown up by the person. But he called ahead and insisted that's the end. So it was the only time he ever wanted the guest to look better than him. And it shows in this video clip, you'll see, he says to her, Sister Thea, have things changed since you were a little girl here in Canton? And she said, oh, well, let's go for a walk. And they shows them coming out of the house and going up the street, and there's a cemetery up on the corner. And she said, isn't this lovely? He said, yeah. And there was a guy, and you can see him in the background on the lawn, cutting the lawn, and nice flowers everywhere. And she said, isn't this lovely? He says, yeah. And she said, well, let's go around the hedge here. And there were trash cans and weeds and overgrown. She said, that was the white cemetery. She said, this is the black cemetery. She said, you tell me how much has changed since I was a little girl. She said, things have changed a whole lot. She said, but we have a whole lot more work to do. And she said, and that's where I come in. As a Franciscan, I'm supposed to be a troubadour for the Lord. And that's why she used music so much, so doing God's work as a troubadour. And so it's just a remarkable interview, And then shortly after that, she was in remission at that point. And shortly after that, the cancer came back in her bones. And they had to ask groups ahead of time because people would flock to her after her talks. Big auditoriums, hundreds and hundreds of people. And they'd go up to hug her and they'd make an announcement, please don't try to hug her. It causes her great pain. And but they would do it anyhow and hug her legs. And she was on a stage and in a wheelchair. And somebody said to her, how do you let people do that? It causes you so much pain. And she said, Jesus went through a lot of pain and suffering. So if he could do it, so can I. Something, to that effect, that she just linked her pain to Jesus. And that's what helped her get through. And then and when she died, her best friend Dort told me, didn't meet her until after it was all over, Sister Dorothy, they called her Dort. She told me that 4 of the sisters had come down from the mother house a week or 2 before to be with her. They knew it was imminent. And people were flying in from all over the country to say, she said, cardinals and bishops. And she was a big deal. And she said that all of them thought they were coming in to give her comfort. And they were leaving, getting more comfort from her than what they had given her. And she said the night before she died, some of her childhood friends were in the room and the sisters, and she died peacefully, of cancer, bone cancer at this point. And she said she went outside to just have a moment to herself to reflect on what had just happened. And she said, I went into the backyard and all the roses were in full bloom. And she said, they weren't the day before. So she said, I think a saint just died in that bedroom, So I learned all these stories. That's what kept adding to my talks over the years. And I've just become such a huge, so I was thrilled when she was named Servant of God several years ago. The Diocese of Jackson, Mississippi is the ones sponsoring her canonization process. The sisters were back and forth about it, and they finally decided it meant more coming from the people of Jackson that she served. They said, we already know she's a saint. They didn't need to do that. So that's how it's happening. There are now 6 African Americans up for sainthood. I already told you a little bit about Augustus Tolton, and she's one of them. And so it's sign of progress, again, slow moving. And it's all about follow the money. Everything in the church is follow the money. Pope Francis did a lot to do away with the canonization because it costs millions of dollars. I know a sister in a community, Divine Providence, their foundress, Mother Theodore, was canonized years ago in Indiana, from Indiana. And she said the day of the canonization, a representative from the diocese said, it's customary that we would be given a gift of something like $20,000 or something. And, from the community whose order it was. And sister said, oh, we'll have a book for you. They gave her a book or a biography of instead of $20,000. But I guess that was typical. I hate to say anything, and I don't have anything against Carlo Acutis, but 15-year-old kid who knew how to use computers is now a saint, and that's wonderful. Young people need saints, but I'm thinking these 6 people should be in line ahead of him, Speak more to me anyhow. But all that aside, here's a couple of her lines. Bring people into situations where they can share your treasure, your art, your food, your prayer, your history, your traditions, the coping mechanisms that enabled you to survive. And on the right, I can't preach in the church. Women can't preach in the Catholic Church, but I can preach in the streets, in the neighborhood, in the home, in the family. And preaching done in the home brings life and meaning to the word preached in the pulpit. She went to Catholic U, as I said, and got her PhD. Went over to England at one point. She did her PhD thesis on St. Thomas More. He was her favorite saint. We are not alike. Our diversity is our richness. Our diversity is our gift to one another. I'm beautiful. What does that mean? It means I'm caring. It means I respect myself. It means I am confident. And so look for other videos when you Google her. YouTube has several of them. One of which is the one that inspired me the most. It's called Her Own Story. And there's another one that Paulus, I forget who produced it, but it's her interviews from her deathbed. And she was her sick bed, you know. And it's just amazing the things that she came out with. So, and there's so much else in there. But her last great talk was to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops in 1989. And it was in June of 89, and it was held at Seton Hall in New Jersey, outside of in Newark, New Jersey, outside of Newark. And they had been after her for ages to come speak. She spoke to the bishops before once, and she and a Hispanic woman were the only two invited speakers. This is not this one, it's a couple years prior to this. And they were asked to come and share reflections on their stories to all the bishops. And after lunch break, Thea turned to the Hispanic woman and she said, "Oh, let's go sit up on the stage." And because they had couches and nice chairs up on the stage for the cardinals. And we can't do that. She said, "Well, that's just for the cardinals." She said, "We'll get in trouble if we try to sit in those couches." And Thea said, "Honey, you're the only Latina here and I'm the only black. They're not going to bother us." So not only did she sit in the couch, she put her feet up on the coffee table that was up there on the stage. And nobody bothered her. They thought her stay up there. So anyhow, she was invited to speak to them at their annual conference. And she said yes, and of course, and then as the time got closer, she was getting sicker and sicker, and she really had a downturn. The very morning she had to leave town, Dorothy told me she was in agony with the cancer, and she told me she shouldn't go. You can't. She said, "No, I promised them for too long," and she said, "I can't not go." So, and Dorothy told me everything went wrong that could. She said their airplanes were delayed and air conditioning was broken in one of the places, I forget what. She said, and then we arrive at Seton Hall and there's 500 bishops sitting in the room and they didn't have handicapped accessibility to get her in her wheelchair up onto the stage. And so with all these guys looking, they had to find 4 men to lift her and roll her over to the podium where she started singing, "Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child." And 45 minutes later, this is a video too, YouTube. 45 minutes later, she has them crying. The camera's always panning the crowd. And she gave her final talks and she started singing "We Shall Overcome," which she always did. And some of the bishops started singing with her. And you could see the look on her face. She's like, whoa. She's, "Oh, well, if you're going to sing with me, let's do it like we did it back in the protest days." She said, "Link arms like this." And because when the winter cannons came and the dogs came, brothers and sisters couldn't be separated. And so the bishops of the United States, all 500 of them, or whatever the number was, are doing this and swaying and singing "We Shall Overcome." Some of them are crying their eyes out. And at the end of her speech, they gave her a dozen roses. And she held them up. Don't forget, she's in a wheelchair in actual pain. You never know. But she held the roses up in the air and said, "I accept these roses in honor of all the women who nurtured you into the episcopacy." and they cheered her on all the more. It's just amazing. Now, I shared that at a thing once at one of my theater presentations with music and all outside in DC. And guy came up afterwards, Tom Roberts. I don't know if any of you know that name. He's a journalist for the National Catholic Reporter. And he said, now retired, but he said, I want you to know, he said, I was at that event. He said, I had to cover it for the NCR. And he said, I have never witnessed anything like it in my life. And he said, to see how she moved that room of bishops, they were laughing with her and crying. And he said, what you don't see in the video clip is that as they were wheeling her out of the room, the bishops, he said it was like the parting of the Red Sea. They were parting to let the chair come through. And he said they were bowing and genuflecting at her as her wheelchair came out of the room. I said, what? I started crying, literally. I said, I never heard that before. He said, it's true. And he said, I turned to the guy next to me, another journalist, and said, we're looking at the future church. And I said, well, what happened? and he said, it's true. He said, that's what's getting me through. I know that's what's waiting for us when all this messy time in the church is over. And that, more than anywhere else, is where I get my hope today in church. Because we're all sitting here today. We're all in the same, we're going to get there, you know. That might not be all the voices you hear from the hierarchy, but who needs them? You know, we're doing it. We're doing the work of God right here. And Pax Christi and everywhere where we live locally. So this picture shows her walking on water, because as I always say, it was her first miracle towards sainthood that she got them to laugh. But she did cry. She had a great sense of humor, and she had them laughing. And so I have her walking on water instead of sitting in her wheelchair. And all the bishops are like, oh, what do we do with this, you know? In all 9 of my paintings, the rosary is the common thread. But this is one of the things she said in the course of that talk to the bishops. How can we work together so that all of us have equal access to input, to opportunity, to participation? That's the synodal church. And that is what exactly the synod was all about. That she was like a prophet. She knew that's what Vatican II is, giving everybody access and input and a voice to be heard, you know? So another great reason that we need to move her up to sainthood, although I myself have already canonized her personally. And this, they've renamed the Campus Ministry Center at Viterbo University, where she taught for 11 years, widely beloved. That night of the blizzard, as I said, so many people came out, and that's what I learned a lot of stories about her teaching days. But kids loved her, students loved her. Boys were new to the school. It had been an all-women's college before. And she was great in a debating team. She, anything to do with music and all that, she was always there. She never held any administrative position there. But anyhow, they renamed the center. So I went down and did a mural there a couple of years ago. And we prepared the wall. And over the course of 3 days, students came and gone and helped paint it. I draw it with Sharpie on the wall. And then everybody comes in and helps paint. And this was the finished product. And it's one of her quotes. We saw it earlier. It doesn't matter if you're scared, just keep on stepping. Don't let your fears get the better of you. And so this one has other Franciscan saints. Over the K is St. Rose of Viterbo, who was who the school's named after, the university. If you look at the T in Steppen, it's St. Francis of Assisi, like the towel shape. And St. Clair's yelling yippee up on top of the exclamation point at the back end. So I'm just the last couple pictures here. I'm going to share some personal stories. I go out to Minneapolis regularly. There's a sister of the Visitation, a monastery that I'm very, very attached to, have been for years. And they're in North Minneapolis. The Visitation Order was founded by St. Francis de Sales and his best friend, Jane de Chantal. So we share the same spirituality. And these sisters, 40 years ago, moved into, they were called the Nuns in the Hood. And there's two branches of the visitation. Some are the traditional cloistered and the traditional habit and all that. And this group wears lay clothes and, real people clothes, and lives right in the heart of North Minneapolis. And I go out there regularly now. They're my big mentors and sisters, old sisters. And these drawings are from a visit a couple years ago. And I stay at their guest house, which is called St. Jane House, which is a lovely little house in the neighborhood. And this woman that you see sitting in the chair was Mary Johnson, who was she's now, she died shortly after the sketch, but she was widely known in Minneapolis because her son was murdered when he was 16 years old. And the boy who shot and killed him was also 16 and was put on trial. And Mary was going to his trial every day, but she sat in the back. She had never met him. And when the verdict came in that he was guilty and that he was going off to prison, the other boy's mother started wailing it right there in the courtroom. "Oh, my baby, you're taking my baby away. I'll never see him again." And Mary said she never felt such anger and bitterness. And they said, "Your son's still alive. He may be behind bars, but you can still see him." She said, "Your son killed my son." And she said she couldn't live with herself. She said, "I'd never been the type of person that had constant anger and bitterness." So she said, I decided to go to the prison and met him face to face and forgave him. And that led to her founding a group called, oh God, I knew I'd get to this moment, but it was for parents of murder victims. I mean, parents of children who have been murdered. But she said from day one, we have to include the parents of murderers too, because they have lost their children as well. So it became a big thing. Every once a week they meet in or once a month rather, meet in St. Jane House on a Saturday morning. And Mary's remarried. She called the sisters once and, "I have great news." And she said, one of the men in her group, the other parents, and she fell in love. And so they married. And so he was when I was visiting on this visit, he was in the hospital having major surgery, I forget for what. And Mary was starting to lose her memory a bit, a little dementia. So Brian, the owner of the house, picked her up, and she sat there all afternoon till they could call the hospital and see how her husband's surgery went. But I just love that whole scene, it's cozy. I love Minneapolis, even in winter, believe it or not. This was taken in May. No, I always say that it's still snowing in May, but it's not. But in any event, there she is, and sitting peacefully. And that very same visit, a family came and they stayed at St. Jane House too for a couple days. And the mother of these two little young teenage kids, who were sweet as could be, and her oldest son had been murdered in Minneapolis the year before. And to get her kids away from that whole world, they moved to Texas. But they came back again because the mother was part of Mary Johnson's group, and I wanted to see Mary. So they were there for a couple days. While they were there, I would, talk to the kids. I said they were just the nicest kids in the world. They were very devoted to their brother who was killed. But the little boy, his name was Jacob, shared that he was learning how to play the clarinet and that he was in the school band. And I said, "Oh, that's so cool. You play the clarinet?" And he said, "Yeah." And they said, "Did you bring it with you?" And he said, "Yeah." So they said, "Oh, we're going to have a little concert." And Brian, the owner, asked his other friend, who is a musician and a poet who had just published a book of poetry, and he asked him to come over to meet Jacob and to encourage him at the age of 13 in this gift. So he sat there and read his poetry and beat on the drum, and the little boy played the clarinet. Am I blocking you there? And it was just this magical afternoon at St. Jane over the fireplace, and winter and cold outside, but all snugly and cozy around the fireplace. And it was music bringing these hearts together, and it was just such a special, memorable day. And I was so glad I had my sketchbook with me. And then that very evening, I went to their parish church, Ascension, in North Minneapolis. They have an awesome pastor. One time I went and the sisters said, "Oh, you should have been here last week." And for Mass. I said, oh, why is that? And they said, well, Dale, their pastor, had to be out of town, so they called the Archdiocese to get a priest to fill in for him to do Sunday Mass. And he said, this guy showed up, and she said, opened his mouth for the homily, and the first words out of his mouth were slamming gay people. And she said, and half the congregation got up and walked out. I said, that is so cool. That's what should happen in more places, you know? And then, and she said the half who stayed said they didn't go for him. They went for communion. You know, they tried to ignore him as best they could. But their parish associate, pastoral associate, who's a woman who's up in the sanctuary every Sunday in an alb, she called every parishioner all week long and said, this will never happen. This is not what Ascension stands for. And that's the kind of parish they go to, you know? So while I was out there at this visit, after Caleb in the afternoon that very evening, the Minnesota Symphony was performing. They do it every year at Christmas. They do Handel's Messiah. And they do it in the Symphony Hall too, but just as a kind of a free thing. It's a free event in the, you know, a tougher neighborhood. And they always use Ascension Church. So they cleared the sanctuary and there was the orchestra up there. I sat in the choir loft and sketched it. And it was just the humbler music in the afternoon and this grand music at night. It was the Handel's Messiah set to a Mexican kind of beat. There was mariachis, and it was just the coolest event. And I just thought it's the healing power of music bringing people together, whether it's the Minnesota Symphony or a little 13-year-old boy. Vincent van Gogh said, if I am worth anything later, I am also worth something now, for wheat is wheat, even if people think it is grass in the beginning. And he said, in a painting, I want to say something consoling, like a piece of music. And we already saw these, didn't we? Dorothy Day said on the right side, if we love each other enough, we will bear with each other's faults and burdens. So these are sketches I do at our local homeless shelter called Joseph's House in Camden. And I like to go when one of our Oblate high schools comes up from Wilmington. They send boys up, Feliciana. So I go, especially when they're there. And this is a food giveaway that happens every Thursday. And clothing, so people can come not just for lunch, but occasionally pick up clothing. Vincent van Gogh said, it's good to believe that everything is full of wonder, to remain sensitive, lowly, and meek of heart. And on the right side is going to be the cover of my next book, which isn't finished yet, almost, but it's called Christ at the Kitchen Door. And it's inspired by the sketches and stories mainly of the people I've met at the kitchen door. And thanks to Thea and Dorothy Day and the great saints, I just see people differently since being in Camden. When I was first asked to move to Camden, I thought, Camden, are you serious? You know, being from Philly, Camden's reputation. One time at the airport, the TSA guy showed him my license and he saw my address. He said, Camden. He said, do people still live there? And I thought, how rude, you know? I was like, give me that card. And, but that's the reputation of it. And I just see it totally differently now that I've been there and meet the Carlos and the people I shared with you earlier this morning. So that's a picture that actually started as one of our homeless guys, Eddie, who no longer comes anymore. That guy could be so obnoxious. But he had a real crazy hair coming out of a baseball cap. And I just gave him a different vibe and turned it into Christ at the kitchen door. But Eddie, it was always nice to do. You know, he cursed. And one time he even cursed his mother. He said, grew up in Florida and she moved. Why the hell did she move us up here that's so cold? And he's always kind of told me he was a millionaire twice. It's like, oh, I believe that one. But in any event, one time we had to ask him. I said, Eddie, you're not welcome here anymore. Don't come back. So he was meeting the ambulance people who would come to help him. And so anyhow, I forget why I was going with that. Let me go real quickly. I'll go through what we were going to do after lunch, if I didn't get so long-winded this morning. So, and I know you're all dying to get up and get out of here, go home and take a nap. And one of my common lines is the Holy Spirit doesn't fly backwards. And that's what so many people want to do, go back, return to the faith they had as a kid. And it's not going to work anymore, folks. You know, we got to move forward. That's what the Holy Spirit does. So one of my great mentors in art and faith once said, something as earthbound as fabric, clay, or paint can speak our most wordless longings, express our delight and grief. Beauty can connect our heart to the divine heart. Francis de Sales, every morning before anything else, asked God for gentleness of spirit. And his friend Jane said, in prayer, more is accomplished by listening than by talking. Native American proverb, listen to the wind, it talks. Listen to the silence, it speaks. Listen to your heart, it knows. Mary Oliver, the poet, when loneliness comes stalking, go into the fields, consider the orderliness of the world. Notice something you've never noticed before. Isn't that beautiful? And that's what contemplative prayer is, silent prayer is all about. And that's why I showed that thing earlier with the cell phones and none of us are getting enough of this. If I didn't have this every morning for an hour, my day's ruined, So, and it's just about having your coffee. And as Francis de Sales once said, don't worry about not saying the right things. God already knows what's on your heart better than you do. All you have to do is be still in the silence. Pope Francis said, there's mystical meaning to be found in a leaf. So I love autumn, and I love when the leaves start coming up here. Yesterday, driving up, the further I came, the more orange and gold was appearing. Hasn't hit down home yet much. And so these are pictures I took randomly. So I just share these to tell you all have cameras on your phone. Use them for prayer. Nobody else is going to see them. It's not like you have to share them or publish them or enter them in a National Geographic contest or whatever. It's just for you to help you remember a present moment that for some reason was speaking to you. So these are pictures I took coming out of Mass once. And I looked down and the leaves were there. And it was just with my phone. Look at the dewdrops on there, It's just, he should be in National Geographic. Happy are hearts that bend, they shall never break. And one of my big things is the first step of the 12 steps, I am powerless. And that's, I'm thinking of doing a book on the stepping with the saints, that the 12 steps are for everybody, not just addicted people. All of us are addicted in some way, I think, but that's what the 12 steps are about. And the first one is to recognize I'm powerless. I can do nothing without God, without a higher power watching over. So when the alligator thing happened, alligator, Alcatraz, I drew the picture first and with alligators, and I didn't know what quote I was going to put in there. I knew I had to have words. And I found this from John Paul II, who said, it's better to cry than be angry because anger hurts others while tears flow through the soul and cleanse the heart. Isn't that a beautiful quote? And Greg Boyle, my current hero, sometimes we are saddled with an image of God that does not create us in God's image. God only longs for us to be joyful. God has little interest in our behavior, only in our abundant happiness. And that's what a lot of people who have a lot of guilt from past life and trauma that hasn't been healed, they're the ones who want the old ways back or want to hide in the tyrant, autocratic leader who's, it's just like, if he can make it, I can too with all my, and if he can do it without getting healed, I don't need to get healed either. Ordinary things all around you can induce worthy musing and devout yearning. That's de Sales. And just as birds have nests, people need hideouts to refresh and recreate themselves. So, yeah, that's the begonia, right? Oh, you're very observant. My brother died of COVID early in April of the 2020. He was a double amputee in a nursing home in Philly. And we were, no visitors, of course, in the hospital. The whole hospital had been turned into a COVID thing. And he had a young nurse, and she would share with us that she was working 18-hour days. And she said, I'm working on a floor I never had to before. And she said, I have a 2-year-old at home, and when I go home, I can't hug her or talk to her or see her up close till I've thrown all my clothes in the wash. It was all those COVID. And, but she said somebody donated iPads to us. So all the nurses had not iPads. And she said, I can go into your brother's room with the iPad and you can all talk to him that way if you want to. And this was so wonderful, you know. So we had it lined up for a Sunday afternoon at 4, and at 3 o'clock we called her just to make sure things were, she said, oh, it's fine. She said, I was in your brother's room. He's not conscious. She said, but I told him that you were all, there's 3 of us left now. And I told them, the 4 of us, I mean, excuse me, told them that you were all going to come and meet him. And at 3:30, she called us to say he had passed that in that half hour. So she said, I can still take and you can see him. I could have done without what he looked like at that point. But she did that. And we all shared what we were going to tell John anyhow. And we couldn't get his ashes for weeks afterwards, and couldn't bury them until September 28th, which would have been his 70th birthday. And so I often do funeral covers for friends. Sometimes I'm even able to see them ahead of time and say, what would you like on your funeral cover? It's never comfortable, but it's gotten a lot better than it used to be to do something like that. And my brother John was not a religious guy at all, so we didn't want a big churchy kind of funeral. We would have had something, I'm sure. But in any event, a quote from scripture or something didn't mean as much. He loved the 60s. It was part of his problem later in life. He loved the 60s a little too much. And he loved the Beatles and any 60s music. So I thought I'm going to put Let It Be on his cover instead of with something else, you know, holy. And I did research, and I got out my inner hippie and did it like the hippie art, the fluorescent art, flower power stuff. But anyhow, I Googled Let It Be and found out that Paul McCartney was very, very close to his mother, and she died when he was 13 years old. And he just never got over it. And meanwhile, he becomes the Beatles, and they're getting worldwide fame and attention, and it was all the stresses that were coming with that and not knowing what to do. And he said he couldn't sleep at nights, and all of the stress was overwhelming. And one night he had a dream, and his mother came to him, and her name was Mary. Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be. And she told him in this dream, Paul, let it be. Just don't give yourself over to all the stress and all. Just kind of let things happen, let life happen. And it was a life changer. And he also said in this interview I read that a lot of people interpret that as Mary, the mother of Jesus. And he said, I'm fine with that. And he said, because that's what art is. We all interpret things the way we need to feel them in our hearts. So I just thought, Paul McCartney was a real mystic. Rita Kent said, the purpose of art is to alert people to things they might have missed. And doing and making are acts of hope. And as that hope grows, we stop feeling overwhelmed by the troubles of the world. She was a great artist, a pop artist in the 60s. Do you remember her, Sister Carita? She was a nun. What's that?
She painted.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Here I am in the home of the tank, the oil, the gas tank. Yeah. Well, she became famous in the 60s. She was on the cover of Newsweek magazine, and the Nuns Go Modern, and everybody loved her pop art. She was influenced by Andy Warhol, and who was secretly a very devout Catholic. Nobody knew that about him when he was alive. But anyhow, she did pop art, but kind of gave it a religious vibe. Like she took the Wonder Bread bag, the logo, has the little circles on it, and she made them all, instead of red, blue, and yellow, they're white. So it looked like the Eucharist, and said that's the real Wonder Bread. And she put on one of them, God's not dead, he's bread. And, all kinds of stuff like that. Well, the Cardinal McIntyre of Los did not like her a little bit. He couldn't stay. He was always writing the Reverend Mother of the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And he said that you've got to get rid of her. This is, I also learned that he was with the loudest voice at Vatican II against the Mass going into the vernacular. He wanted everything to stay Latin and all that. And he was from New York. He was under Cardinal Spellman. That's no surprise to anybody. You heard about Cardinal Spellman earlier. But he just couldn't stand Carita Kent. So she finally couldn't take the national attention she's getting now and pressure from him. So she took a leave of absence and moved to Boston. And Daniel Berrigan was her spiritual director. And that's where then she designed that tank, the big water tank. I'm glad you reminded me of that. Maybe I go see it tomorrow. But somebody up here somewhere in Boston texted me pictures once in the bakery. They had cakes and the icing was decorated to look just like the tank. Well, that's what she said. That's what got her in trouble. That a lot of Vietnam veterans saying she was pro North Vietnam, and that the one streak, the blue streak, looked like a profile of Ho Chi Minh. Really wasn't the case at all, but so they wanted to redo it. They take it down, but thankfully they kept it. I've also done a lot with and this is the last segment, I promise. But with Native American spirituality, and I love Nicholas Black Elk. I mentioned him a little bit, and there's again we could go on till tomorrow with stories, and but I've done a lot of Native inspired art, and that's Jesus with the Sacred Heart. But in his heart are the star patterns of the quilts, and that's what we see. Thomas Berry said, "It's in the fabric of the whole that the divine reveals itself most fully," and this is a traditional star pattern quilt. One of the few good things that Christian missionaries did for the native people was they taught the women how to quilt. And they just took to it like crazy. So the Lakota Upper Plains native women are masters at quilt making, and especially with the star pattern, because it fits a lot of their own traditional beliefs from their spirituality. So these are all quilts made by, and you should see them, they're called eye dazzlers, and just incredible quilts. And I'll just go through some of them here. Elmira, Buffalo Bone, Jackson. And then this is the three women, I call them Sisters of the Earth. I do a whole program on that. And it's Bridget of Ireland on the left, Hildegard of Bingen in the center, and Cateri Tekakwitha on the right. But Cateri's symbol is a turtle. She was a member of the Turtle Clan of the Mohawks, and which is a symbol of the feminine divine, because the turtles are equally comfortable in land and in water. So physical and spiritual, so there are many other connections too. But anyhow, I'm showing that and sharing that because of that one quilt there that looks like a turtle shell. Isn't that beautiful? So I often in groups now, and this was the plan today, but we don't, we'll just have to come back sometime and do it. We got all those crayons, and I was going to have you design turtle shells like this group. This was a Ignatian volunteer group in Baltimore that I was with a couple of years ago, and I just told everybody, design a turtle shell, and they had a good old time. That's right. I'll glue your faces onto those. And then quilts, while we're on the quilt subject, quilts were very important in the slave tradition. And so that's what, in this image of Mary, she's wearing the quilt patterns that, it's not written anywhere, but it was word of mouth that quilt patterns were symbolic to help slaves on the run if they wanted to get on the Underground Railroad. And they would identify by these quilts, like the one at Mary's womb there is called, oh gosh, I'm starting to lose it this afternoon. But it's for them, it meant they would show that one, and it was a symbol to the slaves that the railroad is leaving in a few days. If you want to come, get yourself ready. It always left at like 2 a.m. Not a railroad, of course, it was the Harriet Tubman and whatnot. And so that would give them a head start before the master got up at dawn, So anyhow, so that quilt pattern meant, and how they often got slaves across was in wagons that had false bottoms. They'd get whole families in there and seal up the bottom of the wagon and go over from Maryland into Delaware or Pennsylvania across the state lines. And so the Mary in her dress here, underneath is the triangles pattern, and that's called flying geese. And that meant when you're in the woods, follow the geese who are going back north to Canada. and they'll lead you to Canada and freedom and follow the goose droppings when you see them in the fields. And the one at the bottom was Crossroads, and that meant go into town and you'll see a symbol of a safe house you can stay in to keep you, for a little while. And up top in the upper right is the North Star, and that meant follow the Big Dipper, and that always leads you north. Follow the Drinking Gourd was a song they made out of that. They called the Big Dipper the Drinking Gourd. So I love all those symbols, and so I did a whole series of scenes from the life of Augustus Tolton with quilts and words from the spirituals, and that's his mother with her two little boys and infant daughter in bed under a quilt, and the Holy Spirit's up on the headboard with his eyes on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. And she discerned about escaping, and she did once, and got through, stayed hid in the woods until she got to the Mississippi River, and she didn't know what to do. She wasn't expecting there wasn't going to be a river there, and she had been owned by a Catholic family, so she had kind of a Catholic faith about her. But there was a rowboat there, so she got the kids in the rowboat and rowed across the river, and on the other side was a Union soldier who helped her. He said, "You need to get up to the town of Quincy." And he said, "That's where a lot of slaves go." And he said, "But you have to be careful because there's a lot of bounty hunters and slave catchers here because they got a lot of money doing that." So she still wasn't safe yet, even though she was in Union territory. And she got to Quincy and eventually met a priest named Father Peter McGrath, who was an Irish immigrant who had come here to escape the potato famine and British oppression. And he said, in the United States, we're doing to black people what the Brits were doing to the Irish over there. And so he took Augustus under his wing, educated him, tutored him at night, got him to school. He went to the local parish school, which was run by Franciscans. And that pastor said, "Sure, we'll take him in," but so many parents threatened to take their kids out of school if they let that little boy go. So he had to leave there. And the Franciscans helped coach him. He had to learn Latin. He went to go into seminary. Couldn't find one seminary in the United States that would take him. Ultimately ended up going to Rome. And that's what we see on the right there. "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child." And he said goodbye to his mother, thinking, "I'll never see you again." Because he said at that time in church history, would have been the 1880s, that they probably were going to send him to Africa because mission world was really opening up at that point. And but on the day of his ordination in Rome, they said, "You're going back home to Quincy. The bishop wants you." So he went and had his first mass at the parish. 1,500 people showed up, 1,000 of whom were white Catholics. But it was such a novelty. Oh, this first black priest in the country, but they loved him because he was a good preacher and could sing well, chant well. So white people started going to that church. And the other pastors were like, they're taking their collection money over to him, to that N-word. And so they were constantly complaining to the bishop and blah, blah, blah. This went on for a couple of years. They said it changed his life drastically, health-wise. And he kept begging, "Please let me go to Chicago." And finally, the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago said, "We'll have him here and he can open the first African-American parish." And he went, but the stress and strain of nobody was giving money for a black parish. Meanwhile, a white parish was opening next door. They had it built in a year because they got so much funding. So the only way he could make money was traveling around the country as a speaker because he was a novelty. The first black priest, people were coming out, and he probably came up here and he was going all over, but he always get in the last car for the colored, right? In the 1880s. Well, in 1897, he was getting off a train in Chicago. It was a heat wave. They said it was 105 degrees, and there he is in his cassock and all that. And he collapsed on the street. And passersby were able to get him to the nearby Catholic hospital run by the Sisters of Mercy, who reached out to his mother. His mother still lived with him, and his sister, who was an infant when they escaped from slavery. And she got there, and she died. He died that night with his mother right by his side. And I just love that story that the very woman who helped him escape slavery was with him when he died. And she lived 20 more years, then highly revered in the parish community. They called her Mama Tolton. And she was greatly respected. Well, anyhow, his cause was started, I don't know, how 10 years ago now, maybe, and he's up to the venerable level. And it's been initiated by the Archdiocese of Chicago. And then this is I learned of this is the Juneteenth Madonna. And I learned of the Juneteenth, and that in South Carolina in the late 1600s, 1700s, slaves mostly in South Carolina were coming from Congo, which had been already converted to Catholicism by the Portuguese. So almost all these slaves from Congo were Catholic, and they had devout devotion to Mary. And their most important feast day was the Nativity of Mary on September 8th. And they always tried to celebrate it secretly. They even had one plantation even had a statue of Mary deep in the woods where the master couldn't find it and the people had devotion. Well, on September 9th of one year, 1732, I think it was, all the masters went to church on Sunday, Protestants. These slaves were especially hated because they were Catholic too. But in any event, the slaves, 6 men decided to make a run for it because the Diocese of St. Augustine, Florida had gotten word out that if any slave can come here, escape and get here, we guarantee you your freedom and we'll help you get a job. So that became a big destination spot. I never knew any of this, right? And so 6 slaves tried to make a run for it and they were caught by the white slave owners, and a big insurrection ensued. And by the end of the day, there were 30 slaves who had been killed and decapitated. They cut their heads off and put them on wooden posts along the road and along the river, the Stono River. And several months later, the Slave Act was enacted in the South, saying slaves could not learn to read or write. Women had to wear only burlap and uncomfortable fabric. When you see pictures of slaves, emaciated, skeletal, make America great again. We forget we're just as bad as Isabel Wilkerson in her book Caste said, for all our talk of hating concentration camps and Hitler, she said we had them too. She said we just had a more polite word for them. They were called plantations. But that's exactly how the slaves were kept on plantations, So anyhow, when Juneteenth happened, I did this picture of Mary. You can see Jesus in front of a cotton field and breaking the chains of slavery. So, and then lastly but not least, the Quilts of Gee's Bend. Did you ever hear that? It was a small town in a bend in the Alabama River, and nobody even knew it was there. After slavery ended, it became a plantation where indentured servants lived. And the women at the turn of the last century started making quilts strictly for function. They didn't have heat. Their houses were poor shacks with holes in the wall. So everybody had like 7 quilts to sleep under at night. And they had no idea what was happening with modern art in Europe and Picasso and Matisse. And they were doing things just by instinct that were beautiful examples of modern art. And this went on for a couple generations. And a priest in the 1960s was driving through the area. He was a civil rights activist. And he saw quilts hanging on the line. And he said, they're not just quilts. That's art. And he bought them all. It was the first time the women had ever made money from their thing. And he sent them back to New York where they were having a big auction or raffle. And every one of them was bought. And they became very well known. Art museums now collect them, the Quilts of Gee's Bend, Alabama. And there's still women now. There's only 4, I forget how, a small number left. So the culture's dying out. But Sears and then one of the other big trades found out about this, and they said, we'll buy a great big, machines to do all this, and we'll pay you. And but most of the women said, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want to mass produce them. Each one's a work of art, an individual. And these are just some of them. Look at that, weren't they wild? Now that's the housetop pattern, the traditional pattern, but you can see how they each put their own personal stamp on it. So the Philly, I don't know if Boston has that here, probably. They all seem to now, but the Philly Museum had a whole exhibit of them. They just purchased some of them, and these were from that. And the one on the right there is the woman's husband's work jeans. when he died, she did that. And these are like modern art paintings, and they weren't studying modern art. And the young people growing up thought, wait a minute, make quilts. So they're all moving away, which happens, and so nobody knows what the future is. But Martin Luther King spoke there when to get voting rights activated. And he spoke in the town across the river. And when the local mayor, who also happened to be the head of the KKK, heard that Martin Luther King was coming, he burned the raft that was used to get people across the river so that they couldn't go hear him. Well, the people thought we're onto that, so they packed up everything in pickup trucks somehow and went up 19 miles to the next bridge up and came back down again. And he was so impressed with them, he came back to see them again and told them about a march he was going to have. And a lot of the people went. But he also made his funeral plans because he knew, he had a feeling that he was going to be, something's going to happen to him. So he had his funeral plans made out. And he said that he wanted his coffin to be on a horse-drawn cart, like tradition, but instead of horses, two of them had to be mules from Gee's Bend, because he was so impressed with people that they relied on everything on their mules to do their farm work. So this is what he said in that second visit: I came over here to Gee's Bend to tell you, you are somebody. Now, Michelle Obama's official portrait was done by an artist, wonderful artist named Amy Sherald. And she just turned down an exhibit. She was supposed to have an exhibit at the National American Art Museum in DC, the Smithsonian. And they said that she couldn't put one of the paintings in that showed a trans person. So she withdrew the whole 2 years exhibit. She said, I'm not doing it there. I thought, you go. And she went, fabulous artist. But she saw, when she met up with Michelle Obama's stylist or whatever, to find the right outfit to put her in. And she saw this dress, and she said it immediately made her think of the Gee's Bend quilts. So that's a big quilt's it's about 8 feet tall. I went to see it at the National Portrait Gallery, and there was a line of people in front of it, and in front of Obama's portrait too. So it's really cool. So she went down to Gee's Bend after, and to meet the people, and they created that big quilt hanging in the background as a welcome to her. And they're the quilt makers she's standing with. She's the woman in the center with the glasses. And the postage in 2006, the United States made postage stamps out of it. And this is what I was going to have you do, design quilt squares. So these are just from past group, high school kids. And this was at Mary Knoll, the Mary Knoll sisters' mother house. And I do sip and paints now. I've done it just twice, where I teach how to, I give a presentation and then teach how to draw a butterfly, and then you paint it. And this was the BYOB. So every table I was visiting to see, oh, you want a glass of wine? What the heck, sure. So I said, I can tell the better painters have the higher quality wine too. It's nice. And this was for the Diocese of Raleigh, North Carolina. They have an office of Native American and African American. And so I did that thing there, and they had to design a turtle at that one. So be not afraid. And this, I'm going to end with this, just the word love done like a quilt. And on the right side, do not be afraid. And then here's the real end. Just some shameless huckstering, but a lot of you have already been to the back table. But the calendar and card this year, I decided, are the theme of Mater Dei, because Dei is spelled D-E-I. So I just thought, oh, I'm going to show you DEI is a good thing. And did you hear about the Black Bishop, Auxiliary Bishop of Washington, D.C., who wrote an article? Do you know where it was published, Rocco?
Website.
Okay, yeah, it was on the website, and it was saying DEI is God, and it shown that whole thing. He got death threats, and they took the letter down. Getting death threats from Catholics for saying DEI. So don't tell anybody about it, just buy them. And that's the calendar and the Christmas card. And then this is a book, I don't have them with me, but if you're interested, a whole book called Madonnas of Color, which, and then a whole book on Dorothy Day called Saved by Beauty. And GIA Music is where you can get my older books. I can't I don't have that kind of help anymore in the community to sell them. So you can go right to the publisher, giamusic.com, and that's it. Yeah, you people have worn me out. But thank you so much. Thanks for being here on King's Day. I know you'd rather have been at a rally, but here we are. But I've loved every minute. And Father Steve's not here, but thank him. He was a terrific host last night. Either that or taking a nap. I bored him.
Irene, I was going to ask you to come up and share that little piece to send us on the road there from Maya Angelou. I think it's right underneath your chair. Okay. Oh, always is, always is. Have fun.
There's sandwiches back there if you want to take some cookies, that sort of thing. There's a box out there of the T-shirts that I designed years and years and years ago at a Pax Christi conference. This says "Disarming Sister of Peace," and if you haven't taken one in the past, please, if there you can find a size in the box, please take one. Bring it home.
I picked this Continue by Maya Angelou because I read it every morning. It's 15 things I can do in this terrible environment I'm going through. You would think she wrote this yesterday. My wish for you is that you continue. Continue to be who and how you are, to astonish a mean world with your acts of kindness. Continue to allow humor to lighten the burden of your tender heart. Continue in the society dark with cruelty to let the people hear the grandeur of God in the peals of your laughter. Continue to let your eloquence elevate the people to heights they had only imagined. Continue to remind the people that each is as good as the other and that no one is beneath nor above you. Continue to remember your own young years and look with favor upon the lost and the least and the lonely. Continue to put the mantle of your protection around the bodies of the young and defenseless. Continue to take the hand of the despised and diseased and walk proudly with them in the high street. Some might see you and be encouraged to do likewise. Continue to plant a public kiss of concern on the cheek of the sick and the aged and infirm, and count that as a natural action to be expected. Continue to let gratitude be the pillow upon which you kneel to say your nightly prayer, and let faith be the bridge you build to overcome evil and welcome good. Continue to ignore no vision which comes to enlarge your range and increase your spirit. Continue to dare to love deeply and risk everything for the good thing. Continue to float happily in the sea of infinite substance, which set aside riches for you before you had a name. Continue, and by doing so, you and you will be able to continue eternally. Amen. Yeah. Yeah, 18.
Well, 15 cents, yeah. Yeah, and you think should go again there, I don't think.